Colonel Victor Hammond slammed his fist on the table and pointed his finger directly at Staff Sergeant Emily Carter's face. "You sit down, Sergeant, right now, before I have you removed from this room." The laughter that followed cut through her like a blade. 480 Marines were about to march into a valley Emily knew was a death trap, and the man with the power to stop it had just chosen his ego over their lives. If you've never subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happened next will stay with you for the rest of your life. Emily Carter had been staring at the same drone footage for 11 straight days. Not because she was ordered to, not because anyone told her to run a secondary analysis on Black Raven Pass. In fact, nobody had asked her to do anything of the sort. Her official assignment was straightforward: process incoming intelligence, compile reports, pass them up the chain. Standard sniper analyst work: clean, contained, safe. But Emily had a habit that had followed her since her early days growing up in West Texas. Her father, a man who had spent 30 years working cattle country, used to say the same thing every single morning before sunrise. He would stand at the kitchen window with his coffee and say, "Emily, the land always tells the truth. People lie, the land don't." She never forgot that. So when the initial drone footage from Black Raven Pass came across her desk 3 weeks before Operation Iron Shield was scheduled to launch, she did what she always did. She looked, really looked, not at the surface, not at what the report said was there, at what was actually worth. The valley itself was narrow. That much was obvious. Roughly 3 kilometers long, carved between 2 steep ridgelines that rose nearly 800 meters on either side. The kind of terrain that looked on a map like a perfectly reasonable passage. The kind of terrain that looked to anyone who had never walked it like nothing more than a convenient shortcut through difficult mountains. But Emily wasn't looking at the map. She was looking at the shadows. Specifically, she was looking at shadows that didn't move the way shadows should. On the eastern ridge, at approximately the 1,700-meter mark, there was a cluster of shadows along a rocky outcropping that changed shape between 2 different drone passes taken 48 hours apart. The change was subtle, maybe 3 feet of displacement, maybe less. In a normal analysis, a busy analyst working through a stack of footage would have marked it as wind interference, animal movement, or sensor drift and moved on. Emily marked it as human activity. She pulled the footage from 6 days earlier, same location, different angle. She zoomed in until the image pixelated and she could barely make out anything at all. And then she sat back in her chair and whispered something under her breath that nobody else in the room heard. "They've been there a while." She cross-referenced the position against intercepted radio chatter from the previous 2 weeks. Her Arabic was functional, not fluent, but she'd been working with a translator named Specialist Reza Ahmadi, who had a gift for reading between the lines of insurgent communications. Most analysts wanted direct information. Reza always said the most valuable communications were the ones that said almost nothing at all. This one, he told her on a Tuesday evening, sliding a transcription across the table. "This is interesting." The communication was 11 seconds long. 2 voices. The first voice said a single phrase that translated roughly to, "The birds have moved south." The second voice responded with what appeared to be a confirmation sound, then said, "By the trees remember." "That's nothing," another analyst said when Emily showed him the transcript. "That's farmer talk. Probably local civilians talking about weather patterns." Emily didn't think so. She pulled every intercepted communication from a 20-kilometer radius over the previous 30 days and gave them all to Reza. She asked him to look not for what was being said, but for what was being carefully not said, for conversations that felt structured, for language that had a rhythm to it that didn't match casual civilian speech. It took him 4 days. When he came back to her, his expression said everything before his words did. "Emily," he said quietly, pulling his chair close and speaking low enough that only she could hear. "I've been doing this for 6 years. I've never seen coordination like this in civilian traffic. These aren't farmers. These aren't local conversations. Someone has been using civilian communication channels to relay position updates and movement timing for at least 3 weeks. She felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. 3 weeks, she repeated. At minimum, the pattern starts breaking down when I go further back. But 3 weeks of consistent, disciplined communication. Someone is running a serious operation. Emily went back to the drone footage. She pulled every available pass over Black Raven Pass and the surrounding ridgelines. She built a timeline. She documented every anomaly, every shadow that moved when nothing should have been moving, every flicker of thermal data that appeared briefly on night passes and then vanished. Every instance of what could have been a vehicle track in loose rock that couldn't quite be explained by wind erosion alone. And then she did something that wasn't technically her job. She studied the terrain as a sniper, not as an analyst, not as a staff sergeant reviewing intelligence reports. As a woman who had spent years learning how to read ground from above to identify the exact positions where a trained fighter would choose to place a weapon system, to understand the geometry of a kill zone the way a chess player understands the geometry of a board. Black Raven Pass was not a valley, it was a trap. The machine gun positions were obvious once she knew what to look for. Eastern Ridge 3 positions spaced at intervals that would allow overlapping fields of fire across the entire floor of the valley. No blind spots, no dead ground where a convoy could shelter. Any vehicle column moving through the valley floor would be exposed to direct fire from at least 2 positions at any point during the transit. The mortar positions were more frightening. She found 4 of them, 4 elevated positions on the western ridge, each one positioned to cover a different section of the valley. The exit point at the northern end of the pass, the place where any convoy would naturally try to accelerate out of danger, had 2 mortar positions dedicated specifically to covering it. Whoever had planned this understood exactly how a convoy commander would react under fire. They had preloaded the escape route with steel. The RPG teams were the worst of all, because she couldn't find them. She knew they had to be there. No competent ambush commander would set machine guns and mortars without close-range anti-armor capability. But the RPG teams were hidden somewhere she couldn't identify from above, which meant they were good, which meant they had planned this for a long time, which meant this was not a reactive operation thrown together by a local militia with a grudge. This was a professional military ambush. She wrote the report on a Thursday night, 14 pages, single-spaced, every piece of evidence documented, cross-referenced, and analyzed. She included the drone footage timestamps, the intercepted communication transcripts, with Rez's analysis, the terrain study, and her sniper assessment of the firing positions. She included her conclusion in the first paragraph, not the last, because she wanted whoever read it to understand immediately what they were looking at before they got into the evidence. She called it what it was. Black Raven Pass constitutes a prepared ambush position of significant scale and sophistication. Operation Iron Shield, as currently planned, will expose 480 Marines to coordinated fires from multiple prepared positions with no viable covered withdrawal route. This operation should not proceed without a complete reassessment of the intelligence picture. She submitted it through proper channels at 2200 hours. By 600 the next morning, she had received a response from the operations section that contained exactly 12 words. Report reviewed. Intelligence assessment does not support your conclusions. Proceed with assigned duties. 12 words. She stared at those 12 words for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the operations officer directly. Major Daniel Reese was a capable officer, generally well regarded, the kind of man who followed procedure with a religious devotion that had served him well through 2 previous deployments. He answered on the 3rd ring. Reese. Sir, this is Staff Sergeant Carter. I submitted an intelligence assessment last night regarding Black Raven Pass. I wanted to follow up directly. A pause. I received your report, Sergeant. Sir, I believe the evidence strongly indicates the division intelligence staff has reviewed the area extensively, Reese said, and his voice carried that particular kind of careful patience that senior officers used when they were trying to end a conversation without appearing dismissive. Their assessment is that the enemy has abandoned the valley. Your analysis is based on a secondary review of footage that has already been processed. Sir, with respect, I don't believe the footage was analyzed for deliberate concealment. I believe, Sergeant, his voice sharpened slightly, your report has been noted. The operation will proceed on schedule. Is there anything else? There was a long silence. No, sir. She hung up. For approximately 90 seconds, Emily Carter sat completely still at her desk and thought about what she was going to do next. Around her, the base operated with its usual controlled energy. Keyboards clicked. Radio traffic murmured in the background. Someone in the next room was laughing about something. The ordinary sounds of a military installation on an ordinary morning completely unaware that 480 men were scheduled to walk into a slaughterhouse in 5 days. Then she stood up. "Reza," she said. He looked up from his work. "I need everything you have, all of it, formatted so a colonel can read it in 10 minutes. Reza looked at her for a moment. He understood what she was doing. "Emily." "All of it," she said again. "Please." He nodded once and started pulling files. She requested a meeting with Colonel Victor Hammond the following morning. She did not request the meeting directly. She submitted the request through his executive officer, Captain Briggs, a young officer who seemed vaguely uncomfortable every time Emily spoke to him, in the way that some people are uncomfortable around individuals who move with too much certainty. Briggs told her the colonel was extremely busy, but would give her 10 minutes before the afternoon briefing. 10 minutes. She spent the entire night preparing for those 10 minutes. She organized everything into a single binder. Physical copies because Hammond was known to prefer paper over digital. She tabbed every major section. She prepared talking points with timestamps. She ran through the briefing in her head until she could deliver the key conclusions in under 3 minutes, leaving 7 minutes for questions and discussion. She was ready. She walked into Hammond's office the next afternoon and found not the private meeting she had expected, but a room full of people. Hammond's senior staff was present, 3 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors. The division intelligence officer, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Faraday, who had spent the last 2 weeks confidently briefing everyone that Black Raven Pass was clear. And in the corner, quiet and watchful, Captain Briggs with his notepad. Hammond sat at the head of the table. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had been the most decorated person in every room he'd entered for the past 20 years. He had ribbons for things that other men had only read about. He had a combat action ribbon and a bronze star with valor and a photograph on his wall, shaking hands with 2 different secretaries of defense. He was not a man who had been wrong often, at least not in ways that anyone had been willing to tell him about. He looked at Emily the way a man looks at an interruption. "Sergeant Carter," he said without standing, without offering her a seat. "I understand you have concerns about our intelligence picture." "Yes, sir." She set the binder on the table. "I've documented what I believe is strong evidence of a prepared ambush position along the full length of Black Raven Pass. I'd like to walk you through the key." "Lieutenant Colonel Faraday," Hammond said, turning slightly toward the intelligence officer without breaking eye contact with Emily, "has your team reviewed Sergeant Carter's report?" Faraday leaned back slightly in his chair with the expression of a man who had been asked to validate something he had already decided was beneath his consideration. "We've looked at it, sir. The anomalies she's identified are within normal variance for the area. Environmental factors, local wildlife sensor calibration issues. Her interpretation is speculative. I've cross-referenced the anomalies against intercepted communications," Emily said, keeping her voice level. "Specialist Amati's analysis of the radio traffic over the past 30 days indicates a pattern consistent with operational coordination, not civilian." "Sergeant," Hammond's voice had a new quality in it now. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was harder and colder than anything that had been there a moment before. "Our intelligence staff has access to the full range of available information. You have access to a subset. Do you understand the difference?" "Sir, I believe the subset I've analyzed contains information that hasn't been." "Do you understand the difference?" He repeated the question in a way that was not a question at all. The room was completely silent. Emily stood very still. "Yes, sir, I understand." "Good." He folded his hands on the table. "Then you understand that a staff sergeant conducting a secondary analysis on intelligence that has already been assessed by the appropriate professionals and then presenting that secondary analysis as grounds to delay a major operation is not something I have patience for." "Sir, do you know how many operations have been delayed, canceled, or compromised because someone at your level decided they knew more than the intelligence staff?" He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what the cost of that is? Not just in terms of operational momentum, in terms of lives, in terms of the trust that these Marines place in us to give them decisive leadership." He looked around the room. Faraday was nodding. One of the lieutenant colonels was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man trying to stay out of something. Captain Briggs was writing in his notepad. "A desk sniper," Hammond said, and his voice had taken on a quality that was almost amused. "Thinks she's smarter than military intelligence. The laughter came from multiple directions at once. It wasn't cruel laughter. That would have been easier to take. It was the laughter of men who found something genuinely funny, which was somehow worse. The laughter of people who had already decided that the source of the concern didn't warrant serious consideration, and who found it almost charming that she tried. Emily felt something happen in her chest that she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation, it was something quieter and colder than either of those things. It was the specific feeling of knowing something terrible is going to happen, and knowing that the people with the power to stop it have decided for reasons that have nothing to do with evidence that you are wrong. She picked up her binder. "Thank you for your time, sir," she said. She walked out of the room. In the hallway, she stood alone for a moment. The sounds of the meeting drifted through the closed door behind her. Normal conversation had already resumed. She was already forgotten. She thought about her father standing at that kitchen window. The land always tells the truth. People lie, the land don't. She thought about 480 Marines who were going to enter a valley in 4 days. She thought about the shadows on the eastern ridge that moved when nothing should have been moving. She thought about Reyes' quiet voice saying, "I've never seen coordination like this." She thought about the 4 mortar positions she had mapped, 2 of them aimed specifically at the exit point where any convoy would try to run. She walked back to her workstation, she sat down, and she started planning. Not for the meeting she no longer had access to, not for the report that nobody was going to read. She started planning for the possibility, the growing, terrifying, almost certain possibility that she was going to have to do something about this herself. She didn't know yet what that something was. She knew only that 4 days from now, at first light, 480 young men were going to walk into a valley that she knew was a trap. She knew it the way she knew anything about terrain. Not as a guess, not as a theory, as a certainty. She went back to the footage. She went back to the maps. She studied the ridge lines above the valley. The western ridge, the eastern ridge, the approaches, the angles, the ranges. She was thinking like a sniper now, not like an analyst, like a woman who was trying to figure out whether one person in the right position, with the right rifle and enough ammunition, could do anything meaningful in a valley full of prepared ambush positions. It wasn't a plan yet, it was the beginning of a question. And the answer she kept arriving at, no matter how many times she ran the numbers, no matter how many different ways she tried to look at the terrain, was the same. One person, right position, right equipment, possibly, just possibly. She pulled the topographic detail for the eastern ridgeline and started calculating distances. Outside her window, the base continued its ordinary life, completely unaware that Staff Sergeant Emily Carter had just made the most consequential decision of her career, without yet fully understanding what that decision was. 4 days. She had 4 days to figure out if she was going to do something impossibly dangerous, or if she was going to sit at this desk and listen to the radio and know with a certainty that would haunt her for the rest of her life that she had been right all along. She opened a new document. She began to write. The night before Operation Iron Shield launched, Emily Carter did not sleep. She sat at her workstation long after everyone else had gone to their racks. The base had that particular kind of quiet that only exists in the hours between midnight and dawn. Not peaceful, not restful, but hollow. Like the world holding its breath. Around her, screens glowed with data she had already memorized. Maps she had already studied until the terrain felt like something she could touch with her hands. Ridgeline elevations, valley floor measurements. Firing angles calculated down to the last degree. She had done everything right. She had submitted the report. She had gone through proper channels. She had requested the meeting prepared, the evidence stood in that room, and taken Hammond's humiliation without flinching, and then walked back out and tried again through every avenue still available to her. She had sent a formal written objection to Major Reese's office. She had asked Reza to submit his communication analysis separately through the intelligence section, hoping a second voice might carry weight hers no longer could. Reese's office had acknowledged receipt. Reza's analysis had disappeared into the system without a response. At 01:30, Emily opened the topographic file for the eastern ridgeline one more time. She had been looking at it for days, but tonight she was looking at it differently. Not as an analyst trying to document a threat, as a sniper trying to solve a problem. The highest point on the eastern ridge sat at roughly 1,840 meters. From that position, a trained shooter with the right optics would have line of sight across nearly the full length of the valley floor. Not perfect. There were dead angles near the northern exit and a significant blind spot created by a rock formation at the valley's midpoint. But coverage from that elevation would be substantial. The distance from the base to the ridgeline was approximately 11 kilometers. 7 of those kilometers were accessible by vehicle on a maintenance track that ran along the outer face of the mountain. The remaining 4 kilometers would have to be covered on foot climbing, nearly 600 meters in elevation, through rocky terrain with no established path. She had calculated it 3 times. With full gear moving at a hard pace in the dark, the climb would take between 90 minutes and 2 hours. Operation Iron Shield was scheduled to begin at first light. First light was at 0537. She looked at the clock on her screen. 0143. She had exactly enough time. She sat with that knowledge for a long moment. She understood completely what she was considering. This was not a gray area. This was not a situation where regulations were ambiguous or where a reasonable person could argue interpretation. What she was thinking about doing was a direct violation of orders, an unauthorized departure from her assigned post during an active operation, and a unilateral combat action without command authority. If she was wrong about the valley, she was going to prison. If she was right about the valley and she did nothing, she was going to have to live with that. She thought about a young Marine she had spoken to briefly at the Chow Hall 2 days ago. Lance Corporal something, she hadn't caught his last name, maybe 20 years old from somewhere in Georgia, who had been talking excitedly to his friends about getting to call his mother when the operation was done. He had been eating a piece of cake from somebody's birthday celebration and laughing about something. His whole face open and young and completely unafraid, in the way that only very young men in the hours before their first real operation can be unafraid. She thought about him. She thought about her father. She stood up. She moved deliberately and quietly the way she had been trained to move when silence mattered. She went to her bunk and pulled the equipment she had been, without quite admitting it to herself, preparing for the past 3 days. Her rifle, a Mark 11 Mod 0 semi-automatic, 7.62 NATO, the weapon she knew better than anything else she owned in the world. Ammunition, more than she should probably carry, spotting scope, rangefinder, radio, survival kit, water for 18 hours. She dressed in full field gear and checked everything twice with the automatic thoroughness of years of training. She wrote a note. She left it on her workstation where it would be found. It contained 3 sentences. I have gone to the eastern ridge line above Black Raven Pass. My intelligence assessment regarding the prepared ambush positions was accurate. Whatever happens, the decision was mine. She signed it with her name, rank, and service number. Then she walked out into the dark. By 400, Emily was at the base of the eastern ridgeline where the vehicle track ended and the mountain began. She had driven the first 7 kilometers alone in a motor pool vehicle she had signed out under a maintenance pretext, a decision that would add additional charges to whatever was waiting for her when this was over. She shouldered her pack, checked her rifle one final time, and started climbing. The mountain didn't care about her plans. The rock was loose in places and deceptive, offering handholds that crumbled when she committed her weight to them. Twice in the first kilometer, she slipped and caught herself with one hand, the other instinctively protecting the rifle. Her lungs burned from the first 20 minutes. By 40 minutes, she had stopped noticing the pain in her legs because it had simply become the permanent condition of existing. She climbed. She didn't let herself think about anything except the next handhold and the time. At 5:12, 25 minutes before first light, she pulled herself over the final rock face and onto the ridgeline. She was breathing so hard she had to wait 30 seconds before she could do anything useful. Then she moved to the edge, set up her position behind a natural rock formation that gave her cover and concealment, and looked through her scope at the valley below. What she saw stopped her breath entirely. It was worse than she had calculated. She had estimated roughly 70 to 90 fighters based on the position signatures she'd identified. The valley below held more than that, significantly more. They were well concealed, and a person looking without optics would have seen nothing unusual, just rock and shadow in the pre-dawn quiet of an Afghan mountain morning. But through her scope, she could see them, tucked into fighting positions, arranged along both ridgelines with the systematic precision of people who had been placed by someone who understood fields of fire. Machine gun teams, mortar crews, and finally the RPG teams she hadn't been able to locate from the drone footage, positioned in a fold of ground on the valley floor itself, hidden in a drainage feature that the aerial sensors had never properly captured. She counted it again. Oh God, she said aloud to nobody. 153 fighters. 153. For 480 Marines who were about to walk in with their guard partially down, trusting intelligence that had told them the valley was empty. She pressed her ear to her radio. The operational network was already alive with convoy traffic, vehicles moving, commanders checking in with each other. The controlled professional chatter of a military operation getting underway exactly on schedule. She keyed her radio. Any station, any station. This is Sergeant Carter. I am at position on the eastern ridge above Black Raven Pass. The valley is occupied. I repeat, the valley is occupied. I am counting over 150 armed fighters in prepared positions. Convoy must halt. I repeat, convoy must halt immediately. Static. Then a voice she recognized. Captain Briggs. Who is this? Identify yourself properly and your authorization for this frequency. This is Staff Sergeant Emily Carter. I am physically on the ridgeline above the pass. I have eyes on 153 fighters in prepared ambush positions. The convoy cannot enter the valley. You need to tell the colonel right now. A pause. Then Briggs again, and his voice had gone careful and tight in the way that voices go when someone is managing a situation they haven't been trained for. Sergeant Carter, you are not authorized to be at that location. Stand by. Stand by. She lowered the radio. Below her, at the southern entrance to the valley, she could see the first vehicles of the convoy beginning to move. The lead element. 4 armored vehicles, then a gap, then the main body beginning to follow. The convoy was long. It would take the better part of 10 minutes for the full column to enter the pass. She keyed the radio again. Briggs, listen to me. The lead element is entering the valley right now. The ambush will be triggered when the main body is fully committed. You have maybe 8 minutes before this turns into a massacre. 8 minutes, please. Another pause. Longer this time. Then a different voice. Reese. Sergeant Carter, Colonel Hammond has been informed of your location and your transmission. You are ordered to stand down and return to base immediately. The operation is proceeding. She stared at the radio for one long second. Then she set it down and picked up her rifle. Below her, the lead vehicles disappeared around the first bend in the valley. The main body was following. She could see the column from above, dark shapes moving through a valley that looked peaceful and empty and completely safe to anyone who didn't know what she knew. She started calculating. Eastern Ridge machine gun position, 1,740 meters. She could see the crew now. 2 men. The gunner was adjusting his weapon's elevation. He was getting ready. She could see from the angle of his body that he was waiting for a specific trigger point, probably when enough of the convoy was committed that breaking contact would become impossible. Her hands were steady, her breathing slowed. The thing about being a sniper was that the training didn't leave you. It didn't matter how long you'd spent behind a desk. It didn't matter that her official role for the past 2 years had been analysis rather than fieldwork. The fundamentals were in her body, the way languages in the body automatic, present, available the moment you needed them. She exhaled. She took the shot. The gunner on the eastern ridge dropped. For approximately 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the valley exploded. The ambush triggered early before the insurgent commander had planned it, because someone had just shot his lead machine gunner, and the fighters who witnessed it panicked and opened fire immediately. That early trigger was the first thing that saved lives, though Emily wouldn't understand that until much later. The convoy's lead element was still short of the main kill zone when the first RPG rounds started flying, which meant they had just barely enough room to stop and take partial cover. Just barely. Not enough. The radio came alive with voices, not the professional chatter of an organized operation. Something rawer and faster than that. She could hear commanders trying to establish what was happening. She could hear vehicle crew members reporting impacts. She could hear underneath of it the specific sound that combat radio traffic acquires when things have gone badly wrong, a kind of compressed, urgent energy that has no equivalent in any other human experience. She was already moving to her second target, Western Ridge mortar position. She had identified it from the pre-dawn setup she'd observed through her scope. The crew was preparing to fire on the convoy's rear element. If those mortars found their range, the rear of the column would be cut off from any possibility of withdrawal. She fired. The mortar crew scattered. She fired again. The crew chief went down. The mortar did not fire. Below her, the convoy had stopped. This was exactly what the ambush designers had intended. Stop the vehicles on the valley floor, expose them to fire from above, prevent any organized withdrawal. But the early trigger in the suppression of the first machine gun had bought the lead element seconds that should not have existed. And those seconds were being used by Marine NCOs to get men behind whatever cover was available. She heard a voice on the radio that she would remember for years. Young, male. The particular kind of voice that belongs to a 20-year-old trying to sound older than he is in a situation that has overwhelmed every preparation he has made. Raptor 6, we have multiple casualties. We are taking fire from both ridges. Request immediate. CAS, request immediate. CAS, we cannot move forward. We cannot move back. Raptor 6, please. Raptor 6 was a senior commander. Raptor 6 did not respond. The communication network was fragmenting. She could hear it happening in real time. The enemy jamming was targeting the primary tactical frequencies. Transmissions were breaking up. Commanders who should have been coordinating were losing contact with each other. The organized response that doctrine called for was becoming impossible before it had begun. She moved to Target 3, RPG team. She had finally located them from above. They had revealed their position in the first 30 seconds of the firefight by firing at a vehicle in the convoy's middle section. She traced the smoke trail back to its origin point, confirmed the position, and adjusted her firing solution. The range was longer than the first two shots. Just over 900 meters with a crosswind, she had to estimate from the flag-like behavior of smoke rising from a disabled vehicle in the valley below. She made the adjustment. She fired. The RPG team did not fire again. On the radio, she heard something change. Amid the chaos and the breaking transmissions and the desperate calls for support, she heard the voice of a Marine officer, she never learned his name, who had apparently been watching what was happening on the ridgeline above him and had drawn a conclusion. There's a shooter on the eastern ridge, he said, his voice carrying a new quality. Not hope exactly, something more cautious than hope. Someone is working the enemy positions from above. I don't know who it is, but they just took out the RPG team that was on our 6. A pause, then another voice, older, steadier. Can you identify them? Negative, I can't see the position, but whatever they're doing, keep doing it. They just bought us 30 seconds. 30 seconds. In a firefight of this intensity, 30 seconds was an eternity. Emily was already on her next target. She had been tracking the man on the western ridge for the past 4 minutes, who was moving between positions with a radio handset, coordinating directing, repositioning his fighters in response to the early trigger, and the mysterious shots that were disrupting his prepared firing lines. She didn't have a confirmed identification. She had a pattern of behavior that was consistent with command and control. In another context, that might not have been enough. In this context, with men dying below her and no other options, it was enough. She tracked him. She waited for him to be still for a moment that lasted less than 2 seconds. She fired. He went down. The effect was immediate and visible, even from her elevated position. The coordinated movement of fighters on the western ridge stopped. Not completely, not all at once, but the purposeful repositioning that had been happening ceased. Fighters who had been moving to secondary positions stopped moving. Several of them dropped back into their original fighting positions, as if uncertain what to do without direction. This was the first major shift in the engagement. Below in the valley, the Marines were beginning to push back. Not advancing, not yet, but the pressure on the lead element had decreased just enough that NCOs were moving men, establishing stronger firing positions, beginning to coordinate with each other in the spaces the jamming couldn't quite reach. She could hear it on the radio, not victory, nothing like victory, but the beginning of organization where there had been only chaos. She had been on the ridge for 47 minutes. Her water was half gone. Her ammunition was down by more than she had planned because she had been working faster than a controlled rate of fire allowed. She was lying completely still behind a rock formation on an unsecured ridgeline, in a combat zone alone, without authorization, without backup, without anyone who knew exactly where she was, or what she was doing, or whether she was still alive. And the valley below was still full of insurgents who, she realized with a sudden cold clarity, had probably figured out by now that there was a shooter on the eastern ridgeline. She heard movement, not from the valley, from behind her. She turned. 3 fighters were climbing the eastern ridge approximately 200 meters below her position. They were moving carefully, using cover, clearly looking for something. For her specifically. Someone below had either seen her muzzle flash or triangulated her position from the pattern of shots and had sent a team to eliminate the problem. She had perhaps 4 minutes before they reached her. She turned back to the valley. She had 4 minutes and she had Marines dying below her, and she had a decision to make about which problem to solve first. She picked up the radio. Any station receiving this is Carter on the eastern ridge. I have 3 enemy fighters climbing toward my position. I need about 4 more minutes. There are Marines below me who are still alive and I need 4 more minutes. Static. Then faintly through the jamming, Carter, this is Lieutenant Vasquez, Charlie Company. We can hear you. We cannot help you right now. We cannot help you. Do you understand? I understand, she said. Are you going to keep shooting? She looked back down at the valley. She looked at the fighters climbing toward her. She did the math that wasn't really math at all. Yes, she said. Keep your men moving north when you get the chance. The northern exit is going to open up. Be ready. She turned back to her rifle. She had 4 minutes. She used every one of them. 4 minutes. She had told Lieutenant Vasquez 4 minutes, and she had meant it as a promise, not an estimate. The 3 fighters climbing toward her position were moving carefully, using the terrain the way trained men use terrain, and she understood that if they reached her before the northern exit opened up, none of what she had done in the past hour would matter. The valley would close back around those Marines like a fist, and she would be dead on a ridgeline that nobody officially knew she was on. She didn't let herself think about that. She turned back to the valley and found her next target. The northern exit was still blocked. She had known from her original analysis that 2 mortar positions had been specifically dedicated to covering that escape route, and both of them were still operational. She had suppressed 1 crew in the first 20 minutes, but suppressed wasn't the same as eliminated, and she could see through her scope that the crew had recovered and was back in position. The second position had never been touched. Together, they created a wall of steel across the only viable road out of the valley, and as long as they were functional, Lieutenant Vasquez's Marines were going nowhere. She needed to take both of them out in the next 4 minutes. The first was at 820 meters. She adjusted her position slightly, feeling the rock press into her left elbow with a sharpness that she registered and immediately ignored. She controlled her breathing the way she had been controlling it for the past 90 minutes with the mechanical discipline of someone who had trained this exact skill until it was deeper than conscious thought. She found the crew chief. She fired, moved immediately to the second position. Longer. Over 1,000 meters, and her rangefinder was giving her a reading she didn't entirely trust because the morning heat was beginning to create thermal distortion along the valley floor. She made her best estimate. She compensated for the wind, which had shifted in the past 20 minutes from a left to right crosswind to something more variable and difficult to read. She found the gunner. She heard movement behind her again. Closer now, maybe 150 meters. She fired. She worked the bolt and fired again before she could confirm the first shot's result because she didn't have time for confirmation. She only had time for the next action and the next. She picked up the radio. Vasquez, northern exit now. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds and felt like 2 years. Moving, Vasquez said. She rolled away from her firing position. The first fighter crested the ridgeline 30 meters to her left. She saw him before he saw her, which was the only advantage she had, and she used it completely. She was moving before he could react, putting distance between herself and her previous position, using the same rock formation that had sheltered her for the past hour, as cover in a different way, now not as a rest for her rifle, but as a barrier between herself and a man who was trying to kill her. He fired. The round snapped past her left shoulder with a sound like tearing fabric. She didn't stop moving. The terrain on the ridgeline was her ally now in a way it hadn't been during the climb. She had spent 90 minutes lying still on this ground, studying every rock and fold and shallow depression from her firing position. She knew this specific piece of earth better than the men climbing up it who were seeing it for the first time. She used that knowledge the way her father had used his knowledge of West Texas cattle land, not fighting the terrain moving with it. She put 200 meters between herself and the first fighter in less than 90 seconds of movement that she would never be able to fully reconstruct because she wasn't thinking, she was simply moving with every piece of training she had ever received, driving her body forward without conscious instruction. Then she stopped. She found cover, She brought her rifle up. The first fighter was visible on the ridgeline scanning for her. The second fighter was 15 meters behind him. The third was still climbing below the ridgeline, not yet visible. She had a window that was going to close in approximately 10 seconds. She took the first fighter. She took the second fighter. She moved again before the third man could pinpoint her position from the shots. Below her, the radio crackled. Carter. Vasquez's voice, and there was something in it she hadn't heard before. Something that was almost but not quite disbelief. The northern exit is open. We are moving. I repeat, we are moving. How copy? She pressed her back against a boulder and let herself breathe for 3 seconds. Good copy, she said. Keep moving, don't stop. Who are you, he said. I need to know who you are. She almost didn't answer. She wasn't sure the answer mattered at that moment, and she wasn't sure she had the breath for a full explanation. But something in his voice asked the question in a way that deserved a real response, not as a tactical query, but as something more human than that. My name is Emily Carter, she said. I'm a sniper analyst. I'm the person who wrote the report. A silence on the radio that lasted long enough for her to wonder if the jamming had taken the frequency. Then Vasquez said very quietly, the report they didn't read. Yeah, she said, that one. She heard him say something to someone near him that she couldn't make out. Then his voice came back full strength. Carter, we are going to get out of this valley, and when we do, I am going to find you. Do you understand me? Focus on your Marines, Lieutenant. Yes, ma'am. She moved again. The third fighter from the climbing team had reached the ridgeline and was moving toward her last known position. She tracked him from behind a rock formation 70 meters away. He was good. He moved carefully and kept low and checked his angles. But he was alone now, and he knew it, and she could see in his movement the particular tension that comes from being the last man on a team that has stopped communicating. She waited. He came to a stop behind a boulder and went still listening. She was very good at being still. After 90 seconds, he moved again. She fired once. He fell. She put her back against the rock and looked up at the sky for exactly 5 seconds. This was something she had never done in training or in any previous operational context, and she couldn't have explained why she did it now. Maybe because the sky was the only thing in her field of vision that didn't require an immediate decision. Maybe because 5 seconds of looking at something other than a scope was the minimum her nervous system needed to keep functioning at the level the next hour was going to require. She looked at the sky, then she went back to work. The situation in the valley had shifted again while she'd been dealing with the climbing team. The Marines of Charlie Company were moving through the northern exit, which meant the pressure on that end of the convoy had decreased. But the fighters on the eastern ridge, her ridge, had reorganized in the absence of her fire and were now hammering the middle section of the convoy with everything they had. She could hear it on the radio. A vehicle was burning. A platoon was pinned in a position with no good cover. A corpsman was calling for help with a casualty who needed surgery, not field medicine. She found a new firing position and started working the eastern ridge from a different angle than she'd been using. This was the part of the fight that nobody would ever fully reconstruct from the drone footage, because the drone footage showed results, but not the calculation behind them. Every shot Emily fired for the next 22 minutes was the product of a process that happened faster than conscious thought: target identification, threat, prioritization, range, estimation, wind compensation, trigger control, repeated over and over with a speed and precision that would later cause the analysts reviewing the footage to initially assume there must have been multiple shooters on the ridgeline. There was one. She was working on her 4th magazine when she heard Vasquez's voice again. Carter, Alpha Company is clear of the northern exit. Charlie Company is 30 seconds behind them. But we have a problem. She was already scanning for the problem before he finished the sentence. Bravo Company, he said. They're still in the middle section. They've got a vehicle down and they can't move it, and they are not going to leave their people. She found the middle section of the convoy through her scope. She could see the disabled vehicle, an MRAP, that had taken an RPG round to its rear axle and was sitting at an angle that blocked the route behind it. Marines were clustered around it, using it as cover. A sergeant she couldn't identify from this distance was organizing them with the kind of controlled fury that is the specific emotion of a man who has accepted that the situation is catastrophic and has decided to be catastrophic right back at it. The fire coming down on them from the eastern ridge was heavy. She identified the 3 positions generating the most volume of fire and started working them in sequence. First position, 680 meters, two men. She took the gunner and the assistant gunner shifted to cover. She moved to the second position, fired twice, and the rate of fire from that location dropped by half. Third position was harder. It was better protected by natural terrain than the others. And the crew was experienced enough to be keeping their heads down between bursts rather than staying exposed. She was working on the angle for the third position when her radio produced a sound she hadn't expected. Colonel Hammond's voice. She had not heard his voice since she'd walked out of his conference room 4 days ago. In the intervening time, he had existed in her mind as an obstacle she had moved past rather than a person she had ongoing dealings with. Hearing him now on an active combat frequency was disorienting in the way that unexpected things are disorienting in the middle of the situations that already require everything you have. Carter. His voice was controlled, carefully controlled in the way that things are controlled when the effort of controlling them is significant. Carter, respond. She didn't respond immediately. She was in the middle of working the third firing position. She fired. The rate of fire dropped. She keyed her radio. Go ahead. A pause. What is your situation? She almost laughed, not from humor, from the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a reality that is too large and too strange to react to with anything proportionate. I'm on the eastern ridgeline, she said. I've been here for about 2 hours. I've suppressed most of the major firing positions. Bravo Company is still in the valley. They need the eastern ridge cleared so they can move. Another pause. Longer. How many rounds do you have left? She checked. Enough. Carter. His voice changed. Something shifted in it that she didn't have a word for. The air support is 12 minutes out. Jammers are still active in the valley. We can't coordinate approach routes until the jamming stops. The jamming source is on the western ridge, she said immediately. I identified it 40 minutes ago. I didn't have the angle to take it from my original position. I have the angle now. A silence that lasted 4 full seconds. The jamming source, Hammond said slowly, is what's keeping aircraft out of this valley. Yes, sir. You have a shot on it. Yes, sir. Another silence. Carter. His voice was different now in a way she couldn't categorize and didn't have time to analyze. Take the shot. She was already moving to the angle she needed. The jamming equipment was positioned behind a low rock wall on the western ridge at approximately 1,100 meters, the longest shot she'd attempted all morning. She needed to destroy not a person, but a piece of machinery which required a different kind of precision. She needed to hit a specific component within a system she was identifying visually through a scope at extreme range. She set up the shot with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that rushing this particular moment would cost more time than taking it correctly the first time. Wind, elevation, distance, temperature affecting ballistic coefficient, the thermal distortion that was now significant in the morning heat. She made every adjustment she could make and accepted that the ones she couldn't make precisely were simply variables she was going to have to account for in volume. She fired. Fired again. The jamming signal didn't drop. She could tell because the radio traffic hadn't changed. She adjusted 2 minutes of angle to the left and fired again. The radio exploded with traffic. Not the broken, frustrated traffic of a jammed network trying to push through interference. Clean traffic. Multiple stations suddenly able to hear each other, suddenly able to coordinate, suddenly able to do everything they had been trying to do for the past 2 hours with half the information they needed. She heard an air controller's voice cut through everything else with the professional clarity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. All aircraft. All aircraft. This is Blackjack Control. Jamming is down. I repeat, jamming is down. We have comms. We have eyes beginning approach coordination. Stand by for fire missions. The valley below her began to change. The pressure on Bravo Company's position decreased almost immediately as insurgent fighters began reacting to the sound of inbound aircraft, a sound that changes the mathematics of every engagement it enters. She watched through her scope as the coordinated pressure from the eastern ridge shifted from offensive to defensive, as fighters who had been focused on the convoy below them began looking upward instead. Bravo Company's sergeant saw the opening. She didn't hear him give the order, but she saw it happen. The Marines around the disabled vehicle began moving organized and fast, leaving the MRAP behind, and pushing north with the specific urgency of people who understand that the window they've been given is not going to stay open. She covered them. Every head that appeared above a fighting position on the eastern ridge, every RPG gunner who tried to acquire the moving column, every crew that tried to reposition to get a better angle on the withdrawing Marines, she found them, and she hit them, and she moved to the next one without pausing to think about what she was doing in any larger sense, because thinking about what she was doing in any larger sense would have required more of her than she had available right now. She was running on something that was past adrenaline and past training and past anything she had a name for. She was running on the specific fuel that is available only in the moments when the distance between what you are doing and what will happen if you stop doing it is measured in other people's lives. Bravo Company cleared the valley at 0812. She heard it on the radio, Vasquez's voice, not Bravo Company's commander, but Vasquez, because he had apparently attached himself to a command radio in the last 20 minutes specifically so he could hear. He said 2 words when the last Marine cleared the northern exit. She did it. Nobody responded immediately to that. Then Hammond's voice quieter than she had ever heard it. All elements confirmed status. The responses came in one by one. Alpha Company up. Charlie Company up. Bravo Company up. Vehicle crew from the Disciple, MRAP, 3 personnel extracted, 2 wounded, no KIA. The casualty numbers that began coming through the radio over the next several minutes were devastating enough. Too many wounded, too many men who had been hurt in ways that would follow them for years. But the number that mattered most, the number that no one who had planned this operation had any right to expect, given what the valley had been, was the number of dead. 11 Marines killed in Black Raven Pass. 11 was not a number anyone would ever say was acceptable, and every one of those 11 names would be carried by the people who loved them for the rest of their lives. But 11 was not 480. 11 was not the massacre that the valley had been designed to produce. She sat down on the ridgeline with her back against the rock and her rifle across her knees, and she let herself be still for the first time in 2.5 hours. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly. She had expected them to shake when it was over. They didn't. They were simply present and quiet the way hands are when they have done everything they were asked to do and the asking has stopped. She looked down at the valley. The aircraft were in it now, doing in minutes what she had been attempting alone for hours. The insurgent positions were being systematically eliminated with a precision and finality that made her single rifle overwatch feel in retrospect very small and very human. It had been enough. She picked up the radio one final time. Blackjack Control, this is Sergeant Carter on the Eastern Ridgeline. All friendly elements are clear. I am the only personnel on this ridge. Recommend you verify before any ordnance delivery on my position. A brief pause. Carter, this is Blackjack. Copy your position. You are marked as friendly. Do you need extraction? She thought about that. She thought about what was waiting for her at the base, the military police, the court-martial that Hammond had almost certainly already set in motion before the jamming went down, the formal charges that would be built from the unauthorized vehicle, use the unauthorized departure from post, the unauthorized combat action, all of it documented with the thoroughness that military bureaucracy applies to everything regardless of outcome. She thought about the note she had left on her workstation. Whatever happens, the decision was mine. Negative on extraction, she said. I'll walk down. She stood up. She shouldered her pack. She began the long walk back down the mountain toward whatever was waiting for her at the bottom, with the sun fully up now and the valley behind her, and 469 Marines alive who should, by every calculation of the people who planned this operation, have been dead. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done the only thing that was possible to do and who now had to face the consequences of having done it, and who was tired in a way that went all the way down to somewhere beneath bone. Her father's voice came to her on the walk down, as it often did in the moments after something large had happened. The land always tells the truth. People lie. The land don't. She kept walking. She reached the base at 0947. The walk down had taken her 1 hour and 38 minutes. Longer than the climb up, which surprised her because going down should have been easier. But her legs had nothing left in them by the time she hit the lower slopes, and she had stopped twice to sit on rocks and drink the last of her water and let her hands do the shaking they had apparently been saving for the descent. They shook considerably. She watched them do it with a kind of detached curiosity, the way you watch weather happen outside a window. Her body processing what her mind had been too occupied to process during the fight itself. She heard the vehicles before she saw them. Two military police Humvees were parked at the point where the mountain track met the base perimeter. Four MPs stood beside them with the careful, neutral expressions of people executing orders they had not been given the context for. Behind the Humvees, a third vehicle. Captain Briggs sat in the passenger seat with his notepad open on his knee, because of course he did. She walked toward them without slowing down. The senior MPA staff sergeant, whose name tag read Holloway, stepped forward and held up one hand. Not aggressively, almost apologetically. "Staff Sergeant Carter," Holloway said. "That's me. Ma'am, I've been instructed to escort you to the Provost Marshal's office. You are not under formal arrest at this time, but Colonel Hammond has requested—" "I know," she said. "Let's go." Holloway looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite professional neutrality, but something in the middle of both. Then he nodded and opened the rear door of the first Humvee. She got in. Nobody spoke during the drive to the Provost Marshal's office. Briggs in the vehicle behind hers had not made eye contact with her at the pickup point, and she hadn't tried to make him. The base around her looked exactly as it had looked when she left it 7 hours ago, which felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Places should look different after the things that had happened. They never did. The Provost Marshal was a lieutenant colonel named Garrett, a lean, precise man in his mid-40s who had the specific quality of someone who had spent a career making judgments and had gotten comfortable with the weight of that. He gestured to a chair across from his desk when she entered. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, at the field gear she was still wearing, the rifle she had checked at the door, the general condition of someone who had spent the past several hours on a ridgeline doing things that were going to require a great deal of paperwork. "You understand why you're here," he said. "Yes, sir." "Do you want to make a statement before the formal proceeding begins?" "I made a statement before I left," she said, "and I left it on my workstation. I assume you have it." He looked down at his desk. He did have it. She could see her handwriting on the paper from across the desk, which meant he had been reading it before she arrived. "Whatever happens, the decision was mine," he read quietly. "Yes, sir, that's accurate." He set the paper down. He folded his hands. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than she expected from a man whose job was procedural. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "off the record, just for one moment, are you all right?" The question caught her completely off guard. She had prepared for accusations. She had prepared for formal language and the reading of charges and the particular institutional coldness of military justice machinery being set in motion. She had not prepared for a simple human question delivered in a quiet voice by a man who appeared to actually want to know the answer. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He straightened in his chair and his expression shifted back to professional. "Formal proceedings will begin at 1400. You have the right to counsel. I strongly recommend you use it." "I understand. You're dismissed until then. Holloway will keep you on base." She stood to leave. She was almost at the door when Garrett spoke again, and his voice had that off-the-record quality again, quiet and careful. "Sergeant, the casualty reports are coming in from the valley. You should know that." She turned. He held her gaze for a moment. 11 killed, he said. 469 accounted for. Wounded are being processed. She didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate to say about 11, and there was nothing adequate to say about 469, and the gap between those two numbers was not something that could be addressed with language in a provost marshal's office on a Tuesday morning. She nodded once. She walked out. The formal proceeding at 1400 lasted 40 minutes. The charges were read: unauthorized absence from assigned post, unauthorized use of government vehicle, unauthorized discharge of a weapon in a combat zone without command authority, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each charge was read in the flat procedural language of military justice, and each one was accurate, and Emily sat through the reading of them with the stillness of someone who has accepted a reality completely. Colonel Hammond was not present at the proceeding. That surprised her. She had expected him to be there. She had expected, if she was being honest with herself, that he would find some satisfaction in being present for the formal initiation of the process she had forced him into by surviving and returning. His absence felt significant in a way she couldn't immediately interpret. Her JAG attorney, a young captain named Flores, who had clearly been briefed on the situation in the past 3 hours and was visibly processing the ethics of it as fast as he could, leaned close during a brief recess. "Hammond is in a meeting with the commanding general," he said quietly. "Has been since about noon." She looked at him. "Why?" Flores chose his words carefully. "The drone footage from this morning's operation is being reviewed. Apparently, the imagery analysis team has been working on it since the aircraft cleared the valley. There are people who are very interested in what it shows." She let that sit for a moment. "What does it show?" she said. "I don't have full access yet," Flores said, "but from what I'm hearing, it shows a great deal." The formal proceeding concluded with Emily being restricted to base pending investigation. No confinement, no immediate punitive action. The machinery of military justice was in motion, but it was moving, she sensed, with slightly less certainty than it had started with. She went to her bunk. She slept for 3 hours without dreaming. When she woke, Reza was sitting in a chair outside her room. He stood when she opened the door. His expression carried more information than his face normally showed, and Reza was a man who had trained himself over years of intelligence work to show very little. "They're talking about you," he said. "I know. I don't mean the command staff." He paused. "The Marines from the valley, the ones who came back. They're talking." She leaned against the door frame. "What are they saying?" "They're saying there was a ghost on the ridge." He looked at her steadily. "They're saying every time the insurgents had them locked down, something changed. A gunner went down, a mortar crew stopped firing, an RPG team that was about to fire just stopped. They're saying someone was up there working for them the whole time, and they don't know who it was." She was quiet. "Some of them know," Reza said. "Vasquez has been telling anyone who will listen. He stood in front of his entire company an hour ago and told them your name." She closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't wanted that. She wasn't sure why, but she hadn't wanted that. Not yet. Not while 11 families were getting phone calls, and 11 sets of remains were being prepared for transport, and 11 lives were being compressed into the bureaucratic language of casualty reports. The living didn't get to celebrate while the 11 were still so freshly gone. "Reza," she said, "my report, the original analysis. Does anyone still have a complete copy?" He reached into his jacket and produced a USB drive. "I made copies," he said simply, "before I submitted my analysis. I made copies, and I kept them somewhere safe because—" He paused. "Because I've been doing this long enough to know that paper has a way of disappearing when it's inconvenient." She took the drive. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He started to leave, then turned back. "Emily, the imagery analysis team, they found something in the footage that goes beyond your positions on the ridge." She waited. "They've been looking at the pre-operation drone passes, the ones that were used to clear the valley for the intelligence assessment." He chose his next words with the precision of a man who understood exactly what they meant. "There are anomalies in those passes that should have been flagged. Anomalies that match exactly what you documented in your report, which means the question isn't just why your warnings were ignored." He held her gaze. "The question is why those anomalies weren't caught in the original assessment." The implications settled over her like cold water. The intelligence failure wasn't just negligence. Someone had missed something that was in retrospect clearly visible. And in the military, the distance between catastrophic negligence and something more deliberate was a very significant distance indeed. "Who's running the imagery analysis?" she said. "A team from division, not Faraday's people." He paused. "Faraday has been in Hammond's meeting with the commanding general since 1300. She looked at the USB drive in her hand. The world had shifted in the past 12 hours in ways that were still resolving themselves into a shape she could understand. She had gone into this morning prepared to accept the consequences of being wrong about the valley, knowing she wasn't wrong. Now the valley had proven her right in the most brutal possible way, and the consequences were no longer running in one direction. They were running in every direction. At 1800, Captain Flores appeared at her door with an expression that had changed significantly from the careful uncertainty of the afternoon. "The commanding general wants to see you," he said. She looked at him. Now. Major General Patricia Walsh was not what Emily had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. Walsh was in her late 50s, compact and precise, in the way that some people are precise, not stiff, but economical, as if she had learned over decades to apply exactly the right amount of everything to every situation and no more. She was sitting behind a desk that was conspicuously clear of paperwork, which Emily had learned over years of service meant that either nothing was happening or everything was happening, and it had all been moved somewhere else. Hammond was not in the room. Faraday was not in the room. There were two other officers Emily didn't recognize, and a civilian in a jacket who might have been anything from a OD analyst to someone from an agency that didn't put its name on jackets. Walsh looked at her for a long moment without speaking. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of someone who was making a considered assessment and was going to take the time the assessment required. "Sit down, Sergeant Carter," she said. Emily sat. "I've spent the past 6 hours reviewing 3 things," Walsh said. "The drone footage from this morning's operation, the pre-operation intelligence assessments for Black Raven Pass, and your report." She paused. "All 14 pages of it." Emily said nothing. "I want to ask you one question before we go any further," Walsh said, "and I want you to answer it honestly without concern for what the answer means for your current situation. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "When you went up that ridge this morning," Walsh said, "what did you believe you were going to accomplish?" Emily considered the question. It deserved the honest answer Walsh had asked for. "I believed I could suppress enough of the key firing positions to change the outcome in the valley," she said. "I didn't know if I could do it. I thought there was a reasonable chance that I couldn't and that I would die up there. But I believed that doing something with a chance of failure was better than doing nothing with a guarantee of catastrophe." Walsh nodded slowly. She looked at one of the unidentified officers briefly, then back at Emily. "The imagery analysis team," she said, "has identified at least 11 firing positions on the ridgelines above Black Raven Pass that show evidence of extended preparation. Weeks, not days. The same positions that you documented in your report." She paused. "They have also identified what appears to be deliberate mischaracterization in the pre-operation intelligence assessment. Specifically, 2 of the most significant anomalies that you flagged were present in the original drone footage and were marked as environmental interference in the official analysis." The room was very quiet. "That determination," Walsh continued, "is preliminary. It will be investigated thoroughly. But I want you to understand the nature of what we are looking at because it has direct bearing on your situation." Emily kept her face neutral. "Colonel Hammond," Walsh said, "has this afternoon submitted a formal request for early retirement." She delivered this information without inflection. "Lieutenant Colonel Faraday has been relieved of his intelligence duties pending the outcome of the investigation." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Emily thought about the conference room 4 days ago, the 14 pages flying across the room, the laughter, the 12-word response that had said everything, and nothing. She thought about Hammond's voice on the radio that morning in the valley after the jamming went down. "Take the shot." 2 words that had cost him something to say, and that she suspected he had known, in the moment he said them, would cost him a great deal more. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "the 11 Marines who were killed this morning." Walsh looked at her directly. "Their families," Emily said. "Whatever comes out of the investigation, whatever happens to Hammond, to Faraday, to me, those 11 families are going to want to know why their sons went into a valley that someone knew was prepared." "Yes," Walsh said, "they are. I need to know that question is going to be answered completely. Not for me, for them." Walsh held her gaze for a long moment. "That," she said, "is exactly why this conversation is happening in this room with these people and not in the provost marshal's office." Something shifted in the air. The civilian in the jacket made a note. Walsh leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Carter, the charges filed against you this afternoon have been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation into the intelligence failure. This does not mean you are cleared. It means the situation requires a complete and honest accounting before any individual consequences are determined. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Walsh sat back. "I also want you to understand something else. The drone footage from this morning documents actions on that ridgeline that will be studied in training programs for a very long time. I don't say that to diminish the gravity of the violations you committed. I say it because I believe in giving people accurate information about where they stand." She paused. "You stood somewhere very unusual this morning, Sergeant Carter." Emily didn't respond to that. She wasn't sure it required a response. "One more question," Walsh said. Vasquez tells me you identified yourself to him on the radio this morning as, and I'm quoting him directly, the person who wrote the report. Yes, ma'am. Why did you tell him that? Emily thought about it. Because he asked who I was, she said, and that was the most accurate answer I had. For the first time since Emily had entered the room, something moved in Walsh's expression. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. Something that might have been under different circumstances and in a different kind of room, a form of recognition between two people who understood what it cost to be the person who wrote the report and kept writing it anyway. Dismissed, Sergeant, Walsh said. Don't go far. Emily stood. She moved toward the door. Carter. She stopped. Walsh's voice was quieter now, not commanding, almost conversational. The note you left on your workstation this morning. Whatever happens, the decision was mine. She paused. I've been doing this for 31 years. I've read a great many statements from people in difficult situations. That is one of the most honest sentences I've encountered. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment. It was accurate, ma'am, she said. That's all. She walked out into the evening air. The base was different now than it had been this morning. Not visually, it looked the same buildings, the same vehicles, the same controlled activities of a military installation at end of day. But the atmosphere had changed in the way that atmospheres change after large things happen. There was a weight to it, a seriousness that hadn't been there in the ordinary morning hours before the convoy left. At the edge of the motor pool, she saw Vasquez. He was standing with a group of Marines she didn't recognize, still in his field gear, still carrying the particular physical exhaustion of someone who had spent hours in a situation that demanded everything from him. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He said something to the Marines around him. They turned and looked at her. Then one by one, without anyone giving an order, without any ceremony or formality or protocol, they came to attention. All of them. Vasquez last. She stopped walking. She stood there in the evening light of that base in Afghanistan, facing a group of Marines who had been in a valley that morning, where they were not supposed to survive, and she didn't know what to do with what they were giving her, because it wasn't something that had a regulation attached to it or a proper military response. So she did the only thing she could think of. She came to attention, and she held it until they stood down. The investigation took 4 months. Emily knew it would take time. She had accepted that from the moment she walked off that mountain. Military investigations of this scale involving command decisions, intelligence, failures, combat casualties, and unauthorized individual action did not move quickly, and they were not supposed to. The machinery of accountability, when it finally engaged, was deliberately slow because the things it was examining were too consequential to rush. She spent those 4 months in a state that she would later describe to exactly one person, Reza over coffee on a night when the base had gone quiet, as living inside a hell breath. Everything was suspended. The charges against her were suspended. Her duties were modified to administrative work that kept her busy without giving her access to operational information. She was on base, she was present, she was functioning. But she was waiting in the way that people wait when the thing coming toward them is large enough that they cannot see around it to what's on the other side. The surviving Marines from Black Raven Pass were not waiting. They were talking. It started with Vasquez, who had apparently decided in the valley that morning that silence was not something he was willing to practice regarding what had happened on that ridgeline. He gave a full account to the investigation team. He gave the same account in almost identical language to his company commander, his battalion commander, and eventually to the congressional liaison who arrived at the base in October as part of the preliminary inquiry that had been quietly initiated in Washington. He was precise, consistent, and completely unambiguous about what he had seen and heard. Other Marines followed. The corpsman who had been able to reach 2 critically wounded men because an RPG team that should have cut off his route was suddenly no longer firing. The vehicle crew from the disabled MRAP, who had heard Emily's voice on the radio and understood in that moment that someone was up there working the problem. The platoon sergeant from Bravo Company, a 20-year veteran named Kowalski, who gave the investigation team a 40-minute account that he apparently delivered without notes and without hesitation. Because as he told the investigators, he had been going over it in his head every day since it happened, and he knew exactly what he wanted to say. I've been in 3 deployments, Kowalski told them. I've been in firefights where I thought it was over. I've never been in a situation where I felt the fight change the way it changed in that valley. Something shifted. You could feel it. One minute we were dying, and the next minute something was systematically taking apart every position that was killing us. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen without someone making very deliberate decisions very fast under conditions that would have broken most people I know. The investigation team asked him if he knew who was responsible. Vasquez told me her name before we were even out of the valley, Kowalski said. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, the analyst who wrote the report. He paused. The report nobody read. That phrase, the report nobody read, began appearing in the investigation documents with a frequency that told its own story. 11 families had lawyers by October. The lawyers were asking questions that the military justice system was going to have to answer, and the questions all circled back to the same point. The intelligence was there. The warning was there. The report existed, dated, signed, submitted through proper channels, and then dismissed in a conference room where the dismissal was witnessed by multiple officers who were now being interviewed under oath. Lieutenant Colonel Faraday's interview took 3 days. Emily never saw the transcript. She heard enough secondhand through Flores, who was still her attorney and who was careful about what he shared, to understand that Faraday's account of how he had processed her report and why he had characterized it as he did was not holding up well against the physical evidence of what the drone footage showed. Faraday had looked at the same footage she had looked at. He had reached opposite conclusions. The investigation was now asking whether those opposite conclusions were the product of genuine analytical disagreement or something more troubling, and Faraday's answers to that question were apparently not satisfying the people asking it. Hammond's retirement request had been approved on the condition that it not be processed until the investigation concluded. He was still on base, still nominally in command, in a reduced capacity, while a deputy ran day-to-day operations. Emily saw him once in the hallway outside the administration building in the 3rd week of September. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. They were perhaps 20 feet apart. She stopped. He stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. The hallway was empty except for both of them and whatever the past months had done to the space between them. He looked older than he had in the conference room 4 days before the operation. Not physically older exactly, but older in the way that people look when something they believed about themselves has been removed and hasn't been replaced yet. He spoke first. Carter, he said. Sir, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working toward something, working toward words that were not coming easily to a man who had built his entire identity on the idea that his judgment was sound and his decisions were right. The 11, he said finally. She waited. I think about the 11, he said. His voice was quiet and stripped of every quality she had ever heard in it. No command authority, no institutional certainty, just a man's voice saying something true. Every morning, she looked at him steadily. So do I, sir. He nodded once. He walked past her down the hallway. She watched him go. She didn't feel satisfaction. She didn't feel vindication. She felt something much quieter and much sadder than either of those things, the specific grief of a situation where being right had cost too much to feel like winning. The congressional inquiry became formal in November. Emily was called to testify in December. Flores prepared her for 2 weeks. He walked her through every question the committee was likely to ask, every piece of documentation she would need to reference every moment in the sequence of events where the narrative could be clarified or confused. He was thorough and he was good at his job, and he was also, she sensed, personally invested in the outcome in a way that went beyond professional obligation. They're going to ask you about Hammond, he told her during one of their preparation sessions. They're going to want to know about the meeting, what he said, what the response was. You need to be accurate and you need to be unemotional, because the moment this looks like a personal grievance, it becomes easier for people to dismiss it as one. It was never personal, she said. I know that. You know that. Make sure they know that. How? Flores considered this. Tell them what you told General Walsh, that the most accurate answer you had was the one you gave. She flew to Washington on a Tuesday in December. She had never testified before Congress. She had imagined it would feel significant, and it did, but not in the way she had expected. It felt less like a moment of reckoning and more like a very long, very formal version of the same conversation she had been trying to have since the day she submitted her 14-page report. The same evidence, the same sequence of events, the same conclusions. But now in a room with cameras and senators and the particular weight of institutional attention that hadn't been available to her in a conference room in Afghanistan. She delivered her testimony in 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was accurate and she was unemotional, and she referenced the documentation with the precision of someone who had spent weeks living inside the details of it. She answered every question directly. When a senator asked her why she had disobeyed direct orders to stand down, she gave him the same answer she had given General Walsh. Because I believed those Marines were going to die unless someone did something. I was the only someone available who understood the specific problem well enough to address it. I accept the consequences of that decision. I would make the same decision again. The senator looked at her for a moment. You would make the same decision again, he repeated. Yes, sir. Even knowing what it cost you. She thought about it honestly, the way Walsh had asked her to be honest, the way she tried to be honest about things that deserved honesty. The cost to me is not the relevant calculation, she said. The relevant calculation is 469 Marines who came home. If you're asking me whether I would trade my career for 469 lives, yes, without hesitation. Every time. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. The formal investigation concluded in February. The report was 112 pages, and Emily read every one of them alone on the evening it was released. It was thorough in a way that military investigations sometimes were and sometimes weren't, and this one was because the people who wrote it understood that the 11 families were going to read it too, and that those families deserved the complete truth. The conclusions were precise and unsparing. The intelligence assessment for Operation Iron Shield had been conducted inadequately. Critical anomalies in the pre-operation drone footage had been mischaracterized in the official analysis. Staff Sergeant Carter's report had been dismissed through a process that prioritized institutional hierarchy over analytical rigor. The command decision to proceed with the operation despite a formal written objection, without a comprehensive review of that objection's evidentiary basis, represented a failure of leadership at multiple levels. Lieutenant Colonel Faraday's mischaracterization of the drone footage anomalies was found to be the result of analytical negligence rather than deliberate falsification, a distinction that mattered legally and perhaps did not matter at all to the 11 families. His security clearance was revoked. His career in military intelligence was over. Colonel Hammond's retirement was approved with a reduction in rank. He would retire as a lieutenant colonel. The reduction was not a court-martial. It was not prison. It was the institutional equivalent of a verdict delivered quietly without ceremony in the language of paperwork, the kind of consequence that the military sometimes chose when the truth was damning enough without requiring further public destruction of the man it condemned. Emily's charges were formally withdrawn. All of them. Flores called her when the report was released. He sounded like a man who had been holding tension in his chest for 4 months and had just been permitted to release it. It's done, he said. The charges are gone completely. No record, no notation, nothing. She sat with that for a moment. The families, she said, the 11 families, do they have what they need from the report? A pause. They have the truth, Flores said carefully. Whether that's what they need, I don't know. I don't think anyone can know that. No, she said. I suppose not. She thanked him. She hung up. She sat alone for a long time. The twist that came in March was not one anyone had anticipated, including Emily. General Walsh called her personally. Not through an adjutant, not through a formal communication. She called the number Flores had provided during the investigation, and Emily answered on the second ring to hear Walsh's voice without preamble or ceremony. Sergeant Carter, I have a proposition for you. Emily waited. There is a program, Walsh said, that has been in development for 18 months. An advanced sniper development and intelligence integration curriculum. The idea is to close the gap between tactical intelligence analysis and field application. To build analysts who can think like operators and operators who can think like analysts. A pause. We've been trying to figure out who should run the initial cohort. Who should be the model for what this program is meant to produce? Emily was very still. I would like you to consider it, Walsh had said, not as a consolation, not as a way of making this situation tidier, as an assignment that I believe you are more qualified for than anyone currently in this military. She thought about the 14-page report. She thought about 12 words. She thought about climbing a mountain in the dark with a rifle and a decision she hadn't quite finished making yet. Can I ask you something general? She said. Go ahead. Why now? Why not 6 months ago or a year from now? Walsh considered the question for a moment. Because 6 months ago, the investigation wasn't complete. And a year from now, the people who need to learn what you know will have spent another year not learning it. She paused. The gap between what analysts know and what fighters can use costs lives. You know that better than anyone. Emily thought about the young Marine from Georgia, the one with the birthday cake. She had learned in the months since the operation that he had made it out of the valley. He was at Walter Reed now, recovering from a leg wound that would change how he walked for the rest of his life, but had not taken the leg itself. She had written him a letter in November. He had written back in January a handwritten note on plain paper that said 3 sentences. I heard it was you on the ridge. I don't know how to say thank you for that. I'm going to walk again, so I think that's probably enough. She had folded that note and put it in the same place she kept the important things. Yes, she told Walsh, I'll do it. The assignment was announced in April. The military community responded to it in the way military communities respond to things that don't fit existing categories, with a combination of skepticism, curiosity, and the grudging respect that competence eventually generates in even the most resistant institutional cultures. The nickname had been spreading through that community for months by then. Ghost Raven. She didn't know exactly where it had started. Vasquez claimed credit but admitted he might have heard it from someone else first. It had moved through the Marine units that had been in the valley, then outward, through the networks that connect military people to each other across bases and deployments, and the particular fraternity of people who have been in situations that most of the world will never understand. She didn't love the nickname. It felt larger than she was. It felt like something that belonged to a story rather than a person. And she was a person, not a story. She had bad days and cold coffee and arguments with the administrative system, and nights when she woke at 300 and lay in the dark thinking about the 11 and about the things she could have done differently and about whether differently would have meant better or just different. But she understood why the nickname existed. She understood what it gave people a way to hold on to something that had happened in a valley in Afghanistan, something that most of the people who had been there still didn't have the language for. If Ghost Raven was the language they needed, then Ghost Raven was what it was. The first cohort of the program began in June. 12 students, 8 men, 4 women. A mix of intelligence analysts and field operators deliberately selected for the cognitive dissonance of pairing people who thought differently about the same problems. The first day, Emily walked into the classroom and stood in front of them and looked at them for a long moment before she said anything. They looked back at her. Some of them knew who she was. All of them knew the story or a version of it. She could see it in the way they held themselves, that particular combination of expectation and uncertainty that people have when they are in the presence of something that has become larger than its origin. She set her binder on the table. Not 14 pages this time. Much more than that. I'm going to start, she said, by telling you what I got wrong. Several of them looked surprised. I got a lot of things right, she said. I identified the firing positions. I read the communications correctly. I made the climb and I took the shots and the Marines came home. Those are facts. She paused. But I also spent 3 days submitting reports through channels that weren't going to respond and requesting meetings with people who had already decided not to listen, and I didn't move fast enough to the option that was actually available to me. 3 days. I kept trying to solve the problem the institutional way when the institution had already told me it wasn't going to help. The room was very quiet. The lesson there, she said, is not that you should ignore the institution. The lesson is that you need to know clearly and without comfort what the institution can and cannot do in the time available. And when the institution cannot do what needs to be done, you need to have already thought through what comes next. She opened the binder. So that's what we're going to do, she said. We're going to think through what comes next. Every scenario, every terrain, every gap between what the analysis says and what the situation requires. She looked around the room. Because the gap is where people die, and I am done losing people to a gap that preparation could have closed. The reunion ceremony was held in August, 14 months after Black Raven Pass. It was not a formal military event. Vasquez had organized it, which meant it was simultaneously more chaotic and more genuine than anything the institutional military would have produced. It was held at a base in California in the evening, in the open air, and the people who came to it were the ones who had been in the valley and the families of the ones who hadn't come back. And it was exactly the kind of gathering that doesn't have a regulation attached to it because it exists in the space between official memory and human memory. Emily almost didn't go. She debated it for 2 weeks. It felt presumptuous somehow to show up at a gathering of people who had suffered in that valley and accept whatever they wanted to give her. She was not one of them. She had been on the ridge, not on the valley floor. She had not been trapped. She had not lost the people beside her. She had chosen to be there, which was a fundamentally different thing from being sent there and having no choice. Flores told her she was overthinking it. Reza told her that not going would be its own kind of statement and not the one she intended. Vasquez called her directly, which settled it. "You are coming," he said, not as a question. "I did not spend 6 months organizing this thing so you could sit in your office being humble. You are coming, and that is the end of it." She went. She stood at the edge of the gathering for the first hour talking to people individually. A corpsman who had been in the valley and who cried within 30 seconds of meeting her and apologized for crying, and she told him not to. A lieutenant who had been the voice she'd heard on the radio early in the fight, the one who said someone is working the enemy positions from above. He was quieter than she'd expected. Thoughtful, and he said something to her that she kept. "I've thought about it that morning a lot," he said. "I keep thinking about the moment when the pressure changed, when I felt the fight shift, and I realized that's what good leadership feels like. You don't always see it. You don't always know who's doing it. You just feel the situation change and you understand that someone made a decision that cost them something." She thanked him. She made her way through the gathering, slowly, not rushing, giving each conversation the time it needed. The families of the 11 were there, and those were the hardest conversations. Not because the families were angry, some were, and she understood that completely, but because grief in a room is the heaviest thing in a room, and she carried her share of it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. One mother, a woman from Tennessee whose son had been 22 years old, took Emily's hands in both of hers and held them for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "My boy went into that valley because people like you were supposed to keep him safe." She paused. "I know you tried. I know you did everything you could. I'm not angry at you." Another pause. "I just need you to know that he was a good boy." "I know," Emily said. "I know he was." The woman nodded and released her hands and walked away, and Emily stood very still for a moment afterward and let the weight of that exchange settle where it needed to settle. Then Vasquez appeared at her elbow. "It's time," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Time for what?" He smiled for the first time all evening. "You'll see." He walked her to the center of the gathering. The crowd shifted and reorganized in the way crowds do when something is about to happen. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't ask. What came was silence first, then one by one, beginning with the Marines nearest to her and spreading outward through the gathering like something moving through water. People came to attention, all of them. The Marines who had been in the valley, the families who had come to remember the ones who hadn't come back, the officers and NCOs who had organized the gathering. Vasquez beside her, standing at the sharpest attention she had ever seen him hold. All of them, facing her. She stood in the middle of it for a long moment. She felt something move through her chest that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She looked at the faces around her, the young faces and the older faces, and the faces that carried grief and the faces that carried something that might eventually become peace. And she understood that this was not about her. It had never been about her. It was about what happens when one person decides that the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of doing everything. She came to attention. She held it until they stood down. Later, when Vasquez drove her to the airport, he was quiet for most of the drive. Then he said, "They're going to teach your case study and leadership courses." "I heard," she said, "Hammond's people are going to teach it." He glanced at her. "How does that feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Good," she said. "If it means what happened in that valley never happens again, good." He nodded. He drove. At the departure gate, she stopped and looked at him. He had aged in the past 14 months in the way that combat ages people, not more than his years, but more accurately to them. As if the valley had burned off whatever insulation had existed between him and the full weight of his own experience. "Vasquez," she said, Thank you for talking, for not staying quiet. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you for going up the mountain. She picked up her bag. She walked through the gate. She had a program to run. 12 students who needed to learn the gap between what the analysis said and what the situation required. 12 people who needed to understand that the report was not the end of the responsibility, it was the beginning of it. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter Ghost. Raven, the woman who climbed a mountain alone with a rifle and brought 469 Marines home, had never believed she was extraordinary. She believed she had done the only thing that was possible to do and then accepted the consequences of doing it and then gotten back to work. That her father had told her once standing at a kitchen window in West Texas with the sun coming up over cattle land was all that integrity ever really was. Not a feeling, not a reward, a choice you made when no one was watching and then lived with completely. She had made hers, and 469 men had gone home to prove it was the right one.